let me introduce our four featured guests. From your left, Del Brewer, Putnam County Prosecutor, 1979-1987. Second, Bob Lowe, Putnam County Prosecutor, 1987. I knew he was retired and old, not that old. 1987 to 1996. Second from the right, Matt Headley, Putnam County Prosecutor, 1996 to 2004. And last but not least, the man in the bow tie on the far end, Tim Bookwalter, Putnam County Prosecutor from 2005 through today. Again, thank you all for coming. Let me just say a few introductory words about how I plan to proceed, and then we're off and running. I'm going to pose a number of questions addressing various issues involving the office of Putnam County Prosecutor and ask each of our distinguished panelists to respond. I'll follow up as needed and also invite our four guests to follow up on each other's remarks as they think appropriate. With four lawyers on the stage, not to mention one college professor, I've asked our guests to try to keep their initial responses to each question to no more than 2 or 3 minutes, and that's going to be hard for them and for me, in order to facilitate everyone getting a chance to talk and our being able to move on to a variety of issues. After the give and take among those of us here on the stage runs its course, if it ever does, I hope to have a little time for question and answers from audience members. So that's how we're going to proceed. And with that, I'm going to come over there and take my seat. I've taken my jacket off because of the intemperate climate in here. But Matt and Tim are invited to do likewise, but they don't have to. And I'm going to start with my first question. I'm going to address it to Del Brewer, and then follow it down. These folks are arranged, in case you hadn't noticed, in chronological order. And this
intelligence going downhill.
But age starts here.
Already started.
Don't forget, they represent over 40 years of occupying the Putnam County Prosecutor's office. Who knows how long Tim's going to serve on? Be 50 or 60, Tim, by the time you get out. My first question.
89.
When you became prosecutor, Del and everyone else, were there any surprises or unexpected challenges that faced you that you weren't expecting? Or did you pretty much know what you were getting in for, and it was all a pretty smooth start?
I need to explain something here. Most of the time when people become prosecutors, they start in the prosecutor's office as a deputy. I did things backwards. I was moved to Greencastle, started practicing, and 2.5 years later I ran for prosecutor. And leading up to that, I had done defense work. In fact, when I campaigned, I stated in my campaign that I had 8 favorable decisions out of 10 jury trials, 7 acquittals and 1 lesser included offense. I have a bad throat here, so I'm going to have trouble talking. But yes, one of the main things, so everything was new to me. I had had no experience from the prosecutor side, so I'm learning as you go. And I can't say I had a lot of help initially. One of the things that really surprised me, I guess, and I had to deal with right away, and I'm so thankful we had a county council that fully understood, is the budget I was handed was extremely low. My memory may be incorrect, but it seems like the budget was almost under $5,000 to pay a secretary and supplies. It was terrible. And the first thing I did was go in the county council to ask, present a new budget. And they fully understood and cooperated and really helped so we could get going. Now, please understand the budget was prepared by my predecessor who I'd beaten in the primary. And he'd been a 16-year veteran of the prosecutor's office. and it really didn't help. Now, what you also need to understand is back in those days, the prosecutor's office was not in the courthouse. They had no place for the prosecutor's office. You operated out of your own private office. And by law, we could not be full-time. Indiana was, or Putnam County was a Class 9 county, I believe was a designation. And you could work full-time, but you were only going to get paid part-time, which wasn't a lot. And when I say full-time, we'll get to this probably later on, but when I did Minnick, of course, you're working time and a half, and your private office is going zero, but paying out expenses. But when I first started, I think that was the major thing I had to deal with, was getting the budget so we could have an office that could operate. We had no investigators, and I had one deputy, which I believe Bob can't see. We had Steve Pearson, then Bob was second deputy, or the second one for deputy prosecutor. And can I take 1 minute to say one thing I'm really proud of? The most pride I take in the time at prosecutor's office was some tremendous people that I was smart enough at least to hire because you made them judges later on. And then they had payback time for me for the rest of my career. But Judge Lowe here, he was one of my first deputy prosecutors, did a tremendous job. Then you got Diana LaViolet back here, who was judge for many years, and boy, I could tell you some stories on her, which I did at her roast. And then one of the people that all of us had a great deal of respect for, and was just a tremendous lady and a tremendous judge, of course, was Sally Gray, who passed away several years ago. And then I got a chance to work with this guy here. He was brought on as a deputy prosecutor while I was in the prosecutor's office, and then I worked under him for several years. But I take a lot of pride for the success that some of these people that at least had a little responsibility of bringing them in. So,
Bob?
I did have the benefit of working for Mr. Brewer for over 6 years as his chief deputy prosecutor before I became prosecutor, so that transition was good. However, we did have an issue that Dell brought up. I determined that though we were still all part-time, it would be best to move back to the courthouse just for the prosecutor's part, and if you had a private law practice, which we did, that should be in your own separate private law office. So day one, we moved the whole office, and there were actually 2 offices. Part of it, the prosecutor's office proper, had been in Mr. Brewer's law office. The child support division had been in a separate office, not in the courthouse. So we took them both lock, stock, and barrel and moved them into the prosecutor's office and had to be ready to hit the ground running January 1, or January 2 probably, actually, the first day of office. Fortunately, as I said, I'd been there for 6 years, and I had Diana LaViolet, who was still with me and was my chief deputy prosecutor, and we planned that, and it went well.
did they have to remodel the courthouse?
Yes, they had to extensively remodel the courthouse. I had a good relationship with the county council and county commissioners. I happened to be their attorney at the same time, since it's part of my private practice. So, but anyway, we worked on, they were remodeling the courthouse in several other ways. So I said, hey, let's plan for a prosecutor's office to be back in the courthouse.
Del mentioned $5,000. That obviously didn't include the salaries of the deputy prosecutors. Right. How is it determined how many deputy prosecutors you can hire? Presumably you pay them salaries. They don't do it pro bono. The state pays the prosecutors and deputies salaries, and they tell you how many you can have. The county pays the other help, the other salaries of the office staff, and the office supplies, and giving you a place to have an office and so on. I see. So the state says, Prosecutor Lowe, you can have 3 half-time deputies, hypothetically. Right. When I started with Mr. Brewer, for the first 6-7 months, there were just 2 of us. That's all, and we were both part-time. Then after that, we got a 3rd, who was Diana LaViolet. And then in my term, we got a 4th. How many do you have now, Tim, total? 4. You're still just 4 of you total? Okay. But along the way, it was made such that the prosecutor and the chief deputy could be full-time, which made a better arrangement. So Tim, are you 4 full-time now? You and 3 other full-time attorneys?
Myself, my chief deputy, the other 2 are part-time. It's because we have a prison. when you have a prison in your county, then the state pays, besides yourself and the chief deputy, they pay the other two. If you're not a prison county, the county pays that freight.
I could tell you a story on this, too.
We want to get on to Matt.
Oh, okay. Might as well take
They
legislature.
warned me about you, Del. Matt,
Yes, I became a deputy prosecutor when Diane LaViolet became judge. And so I was there for about 4 years working with Bob and Dell and a lady named Ann Flannelly. And so then when Bob became the the Superior Court judge is when I became the prosecutor. So I had a great deal, I thought, because I had Dell's experience, Ann's experience, and then I brought on Bob Perry, who had a lot of experience as a lawyer. So I was, quite frankly, the least experienced of everyone in there, and so the transition for me was pretty well. I can remember I was talking to Bob and Tim right before we started today, and I think I took over December 1st, and I think it was one of those really super cold winters, and I think sometime in January or February there was a terrible murder occurred. So I had a murder on my plate 2 or 3 months after I became prosecutor. So, but you know, the stability of everybody being there for so long really helped me out a lot.
Tim, what do you have to add or subtract from all this?
So when I came in, I'd been a defense lawyer for 24 years, sort of like Dell, no prosecutor experience. So I brought in Jim Hanner from Rockville. He'd been prosecutor there. His dad was Cleveland Hanner, sort of the guy that tried the Hollinsburg murders back in the 70s. And I brought in Fritz Modisett, who had been the prosecutor in Clay County. So I tried to bring around me some very experienced people. And then since then, they've retired, and Jim Ensley. My biggest problem coming in was we had gone online. The world was starting to change. We were coming out of the Stone Age. And we had to file our cases online through Indianapolis. So we were going to the PMS system, and it hadn't been done before. So when we tried to do it with the computers, nothing would work. So we got about 6 months into the system before we figured out we needed to buy new computers. And that was sort of the beginning of the big change that's been happening ever since.
And for that, you needed to get additional money from the county?
No, we had enough in the pretrial diversion fund that we paid it. You know, we have if you get speeding tickets or things like that, part of it goes to the county, part of it goes into a fund for that. And as the county budget has stayed static, basically, the council always looks at us every year and says, we'll pay it out of your other funds. So we end up supplementing salaries and a number of things out of our pretrial diversion account. So my budget, I don't think is $1 higher than it was when I took office 15 years ago.
But higher than Dell's $5,000, presumably.
My staff is the same size Bob had or Matt had, I think.
Can you publicly tell us what your allocation from the county is?
You know, I think it's $170,000 or something like that is the total part that the county pays. Child support, every dime that they bring in, they get a 2/3 reimbursement or expense they have. So child support, it doesn't pay for itself, but it comes darn close. Wouldn't you agree, Judge?
Oh yeah, it's the best bang for the buck.
And so,
But Lisa, you're getting 170, and 40 years ago he got 5.
right.
And we know there's been inflation, but I don't think inflation's been
It's
that
different.
much.
Well, we have 13, wouldn't you say 1,300 cases a year now?
1,300, yeah, that's about right. All misdemeanors, and that's not counting the child support cases. That's just the misdemeanors and felonies.
And Del, do you have any idea how many cases you had a year back in the Stone Age, I think is what you called it?
All the defense lawyers wanted to take me on when I first went in, and I think I did, it seemed like 5 jury trials my first year, I think. But the caseload, that's been too far along. It's ancient history. But the reason I mentioned that, there's an interesting thing happened about the new deputies, had to do with the legislature. And I was called over there to testify, and the first thing I told the committee was, if they kept the bill the way it was, I didn't want anybody. And the reason why the initial bill was to have a deputy prosecutor that would be solely assigned to the state farm. And I explained to them, as the prosecutor, I felt it was my responsibility, if there's a murder or a major case there, I could use another person, but I didn't want it if that's all they were working on. We needed to have somebody that was flexible. So if I'm trying the case, I need more people covering the local things. And I was kind of pleased. Some of the people from the prosecutor's office, you seemed like stunned when I said I didn't want anybody. But I think everybody's happy afterwards because they did modify the bill and just added a deputy prosecutor without saying what they had to do. So that was a big help for us. I thought they'd find that interesting.
Let's go to another topic. I assume that all of you as prosecutors work closely with the heads of local law enforcement agents. I see Sheriff Stockton sitting out here, and he'd be an example of such. But am I right that there's the Greencastle Police Department, there's Sheriff Stockton's Putnam County Sheriff's Department, there are the town marshals of Cloverdale, Roachdale, Fillmore, and Russellville, and there's DePauw Public Safety.
Indiana State Police.
And State Police, yeah.
And the prison officers.
And prison, thank you.
And the Fish and Game.
Yeah, thank you for that, too. That's quite a range of organizations, from the 4 small-town marshals to Fish and Game to prisons and to DePauw Public Safety. I'd like you to reflect on those relationships. Are they smooth? Did particular agencies seem to be particularly problematic? I'd like you to comment on that, Del, if you have anything to say, and we'll run down the list again.
With that many people, you're going to have some problems here and there, but they always kid me about talking about Minnick. But Minnick, we had a lot of people. In fact, Dick Rice here is in the audience with us, helped work on that case. And the relationship and the work and coordination that these people did in that case was just extraordinary. In fact, when we tried the case in Brazil, one of the comments I was getting, even from the jurors and people who were watching afterwards, is what a professional police force we had in Putnam County. The guys did a great job. And you get very close to these people. And probably one of the most difficult things that you ever have, well, it won't be the most difficult, but it's certainly difficult, is when one of your officers on any department winds up committing a crime and you have to go after them. I had to do that a couple times. It's not fun, but you got to follow the law, and we did do that. But you get very close to some of these guys. And in fact, be frank with you, I worry about these guys when you're talking about automatic weapons and what they have to face sometime. They're your friends. So, but you have to do what's right if they don't do what they're supposed to. So.
Bob Lowe.
The only organization that, as an organization, there was ever trouble with, in my experience, were the feds. Now, we normally didn't work with them, but occasionally there would be crimes which there was joint jurisdiction between under state law and under federal law, and you might have to coordinate with them in some way. And they usually took a not a very helpful attitude, I thought. But otherwise, individuals, there were some individuals at times that were hard to work with, but part of our job was to try to make it work and try to get them together and coordinate them, and I think, in my experience, we were usually able to do that.
Did you usually work with the heads of these agencies, or did you, whoever the particular law enforcement agent who had done the arrest? So it's not as if everything doesn't get filtered to the chief of police of Greencastle. No. Not everything gets filtered to Sheriff Stockton. Is that right? It's whatever particular deputy, whatever particular police officer is involved. So you know the whole.
Usually you worked with the investigating officer. Yes, right.
Matt, do you have anything to add about this topic?
Well, the one thing is that some of the smaller town marshals and deputy marshals, a lot of times that's almost like the first step in someone's law enforcement career. So they're maybe inexperienced a little bit. Maybe they've worked at the jail a little bit. Maybe they didn't volunteer with the sheriff's department or something. So they don't have the experience, and then people make more money at different positions. So then eventually, maybe the sheriff will start seeing somebody that's at one of the town marshals or deputy marshal, and he'll be looking at him and think, I want that guy. And that's what happens is they pick him out and they move him into a sheriff's position. So that's what I see a lot. So a lot of times you see some of the, the younger guys who are starting out and they just don't know anything yet. They haven't even gone to hardly any of the law enforcement training programs for just a few hours of it. So it's kind of a training ground almost. And the nice thing is that when I was always there, there was always, like, they knew certain people would call and say, we really need the sheriff's detective on this, or we really need the Indiana State Police detective on this, because in the long run, it was get the bad guy, if he or she really did it, and do the investigation right, so the person is prosecuted properly. And that was always a nice thing. Nobody really, didn't took too much of a pecking order, but they would say, yeah, we really need to call in Dick Rice. That guy was like the gold standard for interviews. Everybody knew that. So they would pull him in whenever there was a difficult interview to be done. And that was good. So I thought really they work well together. Sure, there's personalities. I mean, there's probably personality conflicts at DePauw. But I think overall, it's a system that works. And unfortunately, ours, like Sheriff Stocking, unfortunately, he loses his guys and gals to like Hendricks County. They pay better. So that's just part of it.
Tim,
I'm kind of detective driven. Sheriffs come and go, police chiefs come and go, superintendents of prisons come and go, but really it's the detective is the level that really handles the cases for major felonies. And when you lose like Mike Biggs, these guys work with Mike Biggs, and Mike was prolific. He could just churn cases out one after another and do a good job. He was a Putnam County Sheriff's detective. Okay. And when Mike retired, it left a huge hole that I don't know that we've ever filled. And then Jimmy Dungan, he could get any child molester to confess. He was the nicest guy in the world. And I was always amazed. Well, he's the head of the governor's security now, and I've never forgiven the governor for taking my best detective away from me. So that's really what, to me, affects us on a daily basis, is those investigators, like Bob said. Those are the people that we really deal with.
There is one other element, a prosecutor's investigator. There is an investigating officer that works for the prosecutor's office who can be sent out on whatever needs to be looked into further. That was added in my term. Our primary purpose at that time was to have somebody who was well trained in child abuse and molestation cases, because we found that the various police agencies, it was hard to find somebody who really knew how to work those kind of cases. It takes somebody special. And I think you probably still use him primarily for that purpose.
Well, and that's changed. I mean, the sea change, I think that Matt and I would agree on, the last 5 or 6 years, the world has just turned upside down in our business because of electronic media. The way you solve cases now is you download cell phones, because people don't talk, they text, and everything they ever said to anybody is on a text message that we can get with a search warrant. You've got, if you got Google on your phone, I can grab your phone, I can search it, and I can find out exactly where you were at. It tracks every place you've been within a couple of feet. So what we found in the last few years is that investigator that Bob talks about has to be versed in those issues. So we've really trained people to have that sort of electronic savvy. And what does that mean? You get somebody not my age, you get somebody young to do it. If I could hire a kid in junior high school, I would, because they're probably better at it. Okay? But that's what we really is turning to, is that's how you find people today. If you want to track somebody down, you don't do it with shoe leather. There's apps that we can get from the feds where it shows where their TANF check went, where their utilities are, where they're paid, where their cell phone's at. So, boy, that's just a huge part of our job right now.
So this investigator that works out of the prosecutor's office, he or she is a trained law enforcement person?
She is a trained law enforcement person that's certified by the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy.
And how, and
I have the first female investigator.
So if, for example, a detective working under the sheriff or a detective working under the Greencastle Police Department has a case, you can just superimpose your person on top of that case? This strikes me as...
that doesn't happen. I say we supplement would be the way to word it. And a lot of times, a police officer, what they do is they prepare, Dick Rice would bring you probable cause affidavit. and that you file charges. Well, there's a lot of massaging and work you have to do to get ready for trial. And you use that investigator to find your witnesses, to bring them in and interview them again. Not every detective is like Dick Rice was, that would follow up. I mean, a lot of them, when they drop it on your desk, they're done with it. So that investigator, to me, works with me, gets that case ready for trial.
And again, did you have one of these investigators too, Matt?
Yes, yes. We had Gary Hoffa, and we also had a gentleman by the name of David Meadows. And I think, and Dave worked with Tim for quite a while. And
Yes.
I think he's now pursuing his passion of bicycles.
Bicycles.
So, yes, I mean, and
It's far away from electronics, I think.
well, I mean, the person that Tim has right now, she's under 30. I mean, but
And she's a wizard on a computer. She just is.
yeah, but they bring us, you know, like, when Tim says about the search warrants, there is not a week that goes by that I don't sign at least 1 or 2 search warrants for electronic data.
Okay, I want to, since this is a DePauw University site, the DePauw Public Safety is one of the law enforcement agencies that each of the 4 of you had to work with. But they're different from all the others in that the DePauw Public Safety superiors are various people at this private university called DePauw, presumably all the way up to the president and to the board of trustees, which is quite a different kettle of fish. Are there any particular problems or obstacles or tricks to dealing with involving treating with DePauw Public Safety?
Well, if you could answer that one, I need help there.
I thought I might have.
DePauw is a very, and you know, I deal with prosecutors all over the state that have college campuses, and we meet and talk together. And we all have the same problem. I mean, DePauw is an insulated campus. Like most campuses, they don't really want outsiders on. So, you know, if something bad happens, the last thing they want is 5 state police vehicles outside a fraternity house.
Or your special investigator, I suppose,
Correct,
too.
correct. So, and it's very driven by who the president is. I mean, there's been a sea change under your present president versus the last president. So that's a big emphasis. But, you know, and Title IX is this enormous creature that fills up the space in how we deal with criminal cases. You know, we tend to deal different if a crime happens on the DePauw campus than any place else. You know, if it's a 20-year-old boy who commits a crime that works in a factory, there seems to be a desire to treat him different than a 20-year-old sophomore in the Sigma Chi house on campus. And my job is to say we treat everybody the same in the community.
You say that, and do you succeed in accomplishing that?
Not always. DePauw tells us and brings us what they want to bring us. We don't, especially under Dr. Casey, not everything was brought to us. You know, I always jokingly said that the DePauw Public Safety under Dr. Casey for drunken students was a valet service to take them to the hospital till they sobered up and then brought them back. That's not the case today. That's not how it's treated.
Do the other 3 of you have similar perspectives on dealing with DePauw Public Safety?
Let's see, I can remember when I was...
Or not dealing with them?
I mean, when I was very young, I remember there was just one guy, and they gave him a K car. I think his name was Grover. Yeah. And I can remember that, and that wasn't... They're much, I mean, they're a real agency. I mean, they have real law enforcement training. They are the real deal. They know what they're doing here, in my opinion. Sure, they're kind of a little bit can't do, maybe they don't go out in the community as much as what the rest of the police officers do. But, you know, I did a case one time where these DePauw co-eds were branding each other, I think it was, with like a lit cigarette. And I had people calling me from everywhere. I mean, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And, you know, it's like, it's important, but, you know, I've got people that are breaking into other people's homes in our community or doing other really significant crime. But that case took on more press, more publicity than probably almost anything else I did.
And the calls were urging you to be more aggressive in prosecuting or to lay off?
Yeah, it was, you know, half and half. Let them go. They don't do anything wrong, really, you know. just a bunch of kids. No, crucify them, make sure they do everything. They, really hammer them. But they wanted interviews with me, and I was astounded at the media attention that was with that type of a case. I mean, DePauw's got it's got a national reputation, if not international reputation.
Let me ask you the larger policy question. My understanding is that universities, I'll even go further, private universities are the only institutions in the United States that have their own police forces. Bill Gates doesn't have his own police force. He may have security, but so Brian Casey, Mark McCoy, the president of Hanover, the president of Wabash, they've got their own police force and nobody else gets to get one. Do you think that's good public policy to allow this one set of private institutions to, and correct me if my impressions are wrong, to have their own private police forces in a way that not even Bill Gates can have?
Well, they have them, IU has its own.
That's right, but that's a state university,
Right.
and presumably there's some kind of accountability. What do you think about private universities having, well, my characterization, private universities having their own private police forces? Is this a good thing?
Well, Wabash doesn't have one. The interesting thing is Wabash has no police force.
Thanks for telling me that. I didn't know.
I suspect it came about more because of liability issues, more of a civil liability, and you guys have probably got teams of lawyers that said, make sure that we're not liable because we're not adequately protecting somebody. I suspect that's why it's grown.
But I mean, not only has it, I mean, it's one thing, but somehow the state government allows them to have their own police force. Again.
And they have to, Charlene and her force, they've got to go through the academy, they've got to be properly trained, they have to have the authority to do what they do, and they do. I mean, they've got the same training that anybody else.
Let me pose my question a different way. Would the criminal justice system in Putnam County, would law enforcement be fairer and better if there were no DePauw University public safety?
It might be a little more even-handed, and you have to tie, my problem more so right now is the Title IX problem that exists on all campuses, but, it might be more uniform if you had the same, you'd have to have a bigger police force in Greencastle to do it, if that happened.
Matt, do you have any views about whether it's a good thing to?
Well, I think it's a good thing because, number one, probably the parents that are sending their kids here want to have that element there that they know that there's, a safety. I'm sure that if you looked up, that's probably one of the things that all of the parents would want, a good police force. And I just think a lot of like sheriff deputies or city guys, they don't like to deal with drunken DePauw students, okay? And Charlene and her crew can investigate and do what they think's right, whether it's, bringing the case to Tim for prosecution request or, dealing with it where they know, like they, do some of the things, I guess, here. Don't they have some kind of a council that they have to appear in front of, I think?
I think so.
So, and it works out so far. But so I think it's a good thing that they have it. It's nice to have a police presence. If you see a policeman, they're driving around all the time. We all know that people much younger than me, between 18 and 22, they don't keep the same hours that we do. So it's nice to have a policeman driving around all the time, day and night, on this campus. I mean, I think it just helps with the whole perception of safety. And I think that's a good thing because young people, we know, sometimes don't make the right decisions.
Bob and Dell, do you have anything to add about this question?
I don't remember having any problem with them. We worked well with them. In my term, we probably did something maybe no one else has done. I did file criminal charges against DePauw University one time, and I did bring in a lot of defense attorneys and had to do over environment, and it got corrected, and then we dismissed the charge. But we'd actually filed misdemeanor charges against the university itself.
And what was the environmental offense that?
Too many years ago. I don't remember, but I do remember that because we had a courthouse full of defense lawyers.
But
Well, I will say one other thing. I bet this happens to you guys too. when you get a DePauw student that's arrested, and it's always funny to me that you get a call from Chicago or some big law firm, and you're this little prosecutor down in the county, and they're going to come down and make sure that justice is, they give you this big talk. And I always said, man, I love it when somebody comes out, because I get tired of trying to get the local guys, and I welcome to come down. They never did, though.
Bob, you can have the last word on this topic if you wish.
I don't know. I have an opinion as to, on balance, whether it's good or bad. Or clearly, there are pros and cons. If you don't have the DePauw force suite you have, then somebody's going to need to be trained more on how to deal with college students and the kind of problems that come up on college campuses. So I guess on balance, I would say we keep it as is. I'd be on a lot of unknowns and just eliminating it.
Thanks. Let me turn to a more national topic. We know that there's been much noticed and much commented upon so-called mass incarceration in this country. There are more folks in prison, more folks in jails. The trend has been upward. There's been controversy and so forth about it. I think we're all familiar with that. Indeed, the last I looked, Indiana is reported to have, among the 50 states, the second highest percentage of its population with a felony conviction. And 11% of Indiana children either have or have had a parent in prison. This also ranks second among the 50 states. So, I mean, Indiana as a state is very much part and parcel of this mass incarceration trend in the United States, and indeed one of the leaders, so to speak. Now, my question is, in what ways is this trend towards mass incarceration in the United States and in Indiana reflected in Putnam County, and indeed in the very day-to-day job that you folks have done as prosecutors? I mean, is Putnam County, are we reflecting that trend, and is that a good thing, and so forth and so on? I don't know who to start with. Maybe the trend didn't start when you were, yeah. So maybe
Skip people now.
I think it's their fault.
Okay. So let's start at the other end. Let's start with Tim.
Well, I believe that the actual prison numbers in Indiana are flat over the last decade. Right? Is that correct?
In about 25.
20, yeah. So what happened when the Pew Research Center did that study? They throw into the fact of who's on community corrections. But when they say prison, they're not saying who's down there in the State Farm. They're also including community corrections. So I don't believe that those numbers, that everything keeps going up, are correct. The jail population stays about the same. What the legislature did to make the county jail population bigger was when we changed the criminal code in 2014, level 6 felonies who went to the prison now go to the county jail, and the jails get paid a per diem fee by the state. So it sort of maneuvered the numbers around, so there's much more space in the prison, but the county jails are fuller. What I see happen here is we have work release, we have community corrections, which entitles work release, and home detention with bracelets, and that is what we're moving towards. Many, many more people, the low-level felonies, are not going to prison. They're being put on that. The legislature, when they changed the code in 2014, also made many more charges suspendable, which meant you did not have to go to prison. It's basically murder or level 1s, or everything else is pretty much suspendable. The trend really, I think, beneath those numbers is the fact fewer and fewer people are going to prison.
And in your judgment, is that a good thing?
I think so. I think our job, all of our jobs, has been really, about 10% of the people we deal with are real bad folks. 90% of people we see on their worst day, they make a stupid mistake. Our job is to figure out who that 10% is and put those people away that need to be put away. Most people need help. They need to be put back on the right track. When the governor signed the bills on expungement, basically about any case now can be expunged by your record, because Governor Pence did it at the time, but we found out that we had this huge workforce that couldn't work because they had prior felonies on their records. So the legislature created this tool that they can come before the judge and they can ask that their record be expunged on serious felonies. Some of them are just a year or two, but after 8 years, people that have got burglaries and things like that can get it cleaned off the record so that they're employable. That's our job, is to get that 90% back in society and get working. And I believe if you really look at what's been happening the last 4 or 5 years, that's what's been going on. Wouldn't you agree, Judge?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, quite frankly, I think that we are try to be as creative as we can to see who can do it. I mean, the prosecutor will offer through Tim's office, and I know I did, and I'm sure Bob and Dell did too, but we'll kind of put a carrot out there for a lot of the people that sometimes we think you are a good candidate to maybe not have a felony. You did an offense that's a felony, but if you can earn yourself out of it through like a plea agreement a lot of times, we did that, and I think that was successful. I mean, our cases are driven criminally at least 80% by substance abuse. So, I broke into your house because I wanted to get the TV or in your guns because I wanted to go sell them to the drug dealer so I could go get the drugs to get high. I mean, that's, and as the prosecutor, you've got the people that their house got broken into, and they're like, well, we don't care. I mean, that guy broke into our house. He got to go to prison. You're like, well, he's a 19-year-old kid. He got involved in some drugs. He's going to have to get out sometime. Well, and so it's a huge balancing test when you're talking to victims of crime, and the families of the person that's accused. And it's tough. That's probably the toughest job, is to sit down there with victims and the families of victims and talk to them about what ifs and this and that. I mean, I'm sure that Tim has a lot of behind the doors closed conversations with his victims' families. I mean, everybody did. We had to. But we've got to figure out, like right now, we try and do all kinds of different things with our drug treatment. It's not perfect by a long shot. We keep trying to come up with different creative ways to try to make people maybe see the light. And if we can get them going a little bit and get a little bit of progress in their lives, then a lot of times everybody's a winner, because like Tim said, we got to get them working. We need people to work. And if you write a felony down, you're automatically your application's in the stack. That's never going to be seen again.
Bob, do you have anything to add on this, on what your colleagues have said?
I don't. I'm not aware of the statistics while I was prosecutor. The legislature gives us a set of statutes, a prosecutor, a set of statutes to work with, and we're to make decisions about what should be filed and what should be sought in the way of a conviction for incidents that occur in our county and are brought to our attention. So studies, as I understand them, indicate there are a lot of factors that go into how the statistics end up, how many felonies you get, how many misdemeanors. Pretrial diversion for misdemeanors was instituted, I believe, while I was prosecutor, and we immediately made use of that for offenses that were first-time minor offenses. Sure. That could be handled this way, so they didn't end up with a conviction on their record, but they paid a penalty and got the treatment they probably needed. A lot of them were drug offenses, of course.
Do you agree with Tim's characterization that 10% of the people are bad people and 90% are good, and a major part of your job is to distinguish those two groups?
Yes. Now, the percentages, I don't know.
Okay, yeah, and he was,
but sure, distinguishing those groups, that's a lot of it. Exercising your judgment. How serious is this? What kind of person are we really dealing with here? Are they likely to recommit? How should we best try to change their behavior, if we even think we can change their behavior?
I mean, that seems like a very honorable task, and it also seems like a very difficult task. And I'm wondering, do you get any training for that? I mean, it almost seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that seems like kind of a social work task that a social worker would be. So that's a serious question. Do you get any training, or is it something you just develop through your intuition and judgment?
I think you learn it by just a lot of cases and a lot of time. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like the older I get, a little wiser I get about making those calls, because you've you've seen a lot of those cases. So I don't think you can take a class and understand how to do it. I think you just have to do thousands of cases and get a feel for people.
But prosecutors interface, if they do their job right, I think all of us did in this respect, we interface with a lot of social workers in various ways and get reports from them. Or we go to prosecutor conferences, and some of those classes are teaching us about the psychology of domestic abuse, the drug abuse, how all these things work, and how the studies show they can be treated.
Was this as prominent a theme when you were prosecutor, Del?
One of the problems when I was there is, other than the week-long training to start as a prosecutor, first of all, we didn't have the money in the county to pay to send people to seminars and stuff like that. There was very little training that we had, so you had to learn, as you go. Now, when we were later on, in fact, while Bob was prosecutor, he sent me out to San Francisco for the death penalty seminar, a week-long seminar there. And they've actually got a college now in South Carolina where not only federal but state prosecutors can go, and it's an intensive training. But when I was prosecutor, we just didn't have that. I mean, we had to learn as we go. And one of the things they might mention is just give you an example what a prosecutor faces a lot of times, and I'll just use an actual case. We had a gentleman that we put in prison. I can't remember what he was put in prison for at the time, but his family came to me, asked could he get early out, that he had, he'd cleaned up, et cetera, et cetera. And there was, I think, about 10 children. And so I finally agreed and I let him out. Biggest mistake I ever made. About 6 months later, he came home drunk. His beautiful daughter, I think she's about 14 or 15, and he shot her and she was paralyzed for the rest of her life. That always bothered me.
Sorry.
But those kind of cases, I mean, you deal with it. That's part of the job, and you're not God. You cannot know everything, and so you just make the best guess you can and go from there.
By the way, someone I worked with in this respect for years, Ann Newton, is here in the audience, and I think others here do too.
Do any of the three of you, would you be willing to share a case where you think in retrospect you made a wrong decision with adverse, unintentionally, but as Del says, none of us are perfect. Are there any decisions that you made that haunt you? Bob or Matt or Tim?
Sure.
I mean, absolutely. I don't think we're people. I mean, like everyone else, we all regret some of our decisions we've made. And a lot of things that the public sometimes does not grasp the whole time is like, why did that person get such a good deal? Because the prosecutor knows that something has been collected evidence-wise that's not going to come in. From the gun that actually killed someone, or the bullets, or whatever. There was some mess up somewhere along the line in the whole investigation, or something happened that they know is a huge weakness in their case, but they have to obviously disclose that to the defense. But overall, I mean, that's why a lot of the cases get settled the way they are, because sometimes there are some errors that have been made. And we just do the best we can. That's why I said I think we all would agree that there's cases that you kind of look back and go, why did I think that way? But that was the beauty of having, when I was there, of all the prosecutors with more years of experience, I would just bounce the idea off of them.
One of the other things, I don't mean, but your victim, like a child, and the people who are working with them are telling you this child has to go through this trial, they might commit suicide. Boy, you've got to be thinking, and it can change the whole way you handle a case, but you can't go public about that and tell people, oh, this is why you plea bargain this one. But you've got a situation you've got to deal with, and that does happen, like on child molest cases and things like that. It's not unusual.
Maybe the toughest cases, I think, for me, maybe, were those, there weren't a lot of them, but some where you thought that you knew a really horrendous crime had occurred. Pretty sure you knew who did it, based on all investigation had been done, but you knew you just didn't have enough to file the charge. And if you did file the charge and go, you'd probably lose. And of course, with the rule of double jeopardy, you only have one shot at it, the rule against double jeopardy. So you never file it. And then you always wonder, should have I done that? Or did I make the right decision?
Let me raise one last issue, and then I think we'll go to questions and answers from the audience. I don't know what we're plea bargaining. We know that in Putnam County and across the United States, 95% of convictions occur as a result of plea bargaining. And we know that if indeed plea bargaining weren't so common, the prosecutor's office would need tons of more resources, and so would the local judiciary. Right? So one of the reasons for plea bargaining is to conserve resources. If you took every case to trial, Tim or Matt or Bob or Del, you simply would need dozens of more staff.
Oh, sure.
More courts.
And that's right.
But
Yeah.
that's not the reason most people plea bargain. The reason most people plea bargain is you can prove they're guilty. And so I've been a public defender, I've been a prosecutor, so if you get a case and the evidence is real clear that you're guilty, then your attorney, your public defender, your private attorney is going to go in and make an agreement. I mean, sure. I don't know bargain. I don't like the term bargain. It's a plea agreement is what it is. And basically you're admitting you're guilty and you agree to what the sentence is going to be. It's not because of lack of resources we do it. When Steve Goldsmith was prosecutor in Marion County in the 80s, he'd get a burr under his saddle ever so often and say, no plea bargains. This system in Marion County would grind to a halt in about a month every time he did it.
Sure.
And it just isn't going to work. And, most people, if we're doing our jobs, and, a lot of our jobs is screening cases correctly when you get them. The biggest thing the public doesn't know is how many cases we don't file. Would you guys agree? I mean, there's a whole bunch we don't file. So if we do our jobs correctly and we screen that case properly, they're probably going to reach a plea agreement. Unless there's just so much at risk. If you got a level 1 felony and somebody's facing 90 years in prison for child molesting, they got nothing to risk. I mean, they're going to go ahead and roll the dice. Wouldn't you agree, Del, at that point? Yeah. But most people, the reason they do it is that they're guilty and the evidence is very strong.
So are you, each of you, are you comfortable with the role of plea bargaining in the operation of the Putnam County criminal justice system? And the role is that 90%, 95% of convictions come as a result of plea bargaining. Is that something that you professionally and ethically are comfortable with? Because apparently you are, Tim. You're comfortable. You think it's fine. I
mean, and let me tell you, you don't have a good case, a defense lawyer is going to find the weakness and pick it apart.
And people don't realize, too, like if you go to a jury, there's 100 places where errors can be made, something a juror does, or you can have a strong case and you didn't. I know Bob, I think, remembers the case where he had one juror, and even though he told you he wouldn't take something into consideration, turns out he did, and he would never agree, so he had a hung jury. And that costs the county money. And so, those things, there's all kinds of reasons to try to make it work with plea agreements, and a lot of times the public doesn't understand what's all going on. But I tell you, when you try a jury trial, what is it we used to say that it's like? See, what was it? Something that you never know which way to scatter or whatever, because you never knew quite sure what a jury's going to do. Fortunately, most of the time, jurors do get it the right decision. I have to say that, and I've had a lot of respect for many jurors, but you always have that. It takes one person on that jury, and man, you got a problem. And the second time you go around on a case, the state is never any stronger. It's going to be weaker because they know exactly what your case is there.
Bob?
I think plea bargaining is inherent in the system. You can call it by other names or say you're not doing it, but you really are by charge bargaining or something else. And it's good if it's done right. And that's up to the prosecutor and the deputies to see that it's done correctly.
I'll add one thing. I had a defense lawyer, and I'm not mentioning names, but he went through 2 jury trials because I would not bargain more than what I said I would do. And he learned after 2 jury trials he ought to start paying attention to the offer I made because I wasn't going to move any further. So sometimes you have to do that too.
Matt, do you have anything to say about plea bargain? You've seen it both,
Right, well, in Indiana too, a judge can reject a plea, and he or she does not have to even say why. They can just say, no, I'm not going to accept that. So, that's again with the experience goes on. I mean, Tim probably knows pretty much where I'm going to say no or yes. I mean, by far, I would say 98 out of 100 of them are accepted for the most part, but sometimes they're not. So, there's that little bit of a risk there. So, there's another check and balance there.
What happens if a judge rejects the plea bargain?
Then it just goes back to square one, and you just set it up on the trial calendar again, and they can come to you with another agreement. There's another agreement, that can be tendered. In Indiana, you also have to have, at least on felonies, I believe it is just felonies, that the prosecutor has to notify the victim, if there is a victim. And the victim can come in and say, I agree with this, or I don't agree with that. And they have the opportunity to talk. When
judges reject offered pleas, is it because they think the sentence is too harsh or too lenient?
Could be either way.
Which is more common in your experience?
It's probably 50-50. I mean, kind of depends on the whole situation. And I'm kind of saying as a judge role, I don't know what Tim knows about the case or what the defense attorney. I mean, they just kind of come into me and sometimes they'll give me something, I'm looking at them and they're like, well, this is the reason why. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. I've got a witness that's not going to be very helpful for me. I've got a victim who absolutely refuses to go to trial. I've a major piece of evidence, we can't find it. Unfortunately, that happens, not very often, but there's things that are cracks that then you go, okay, well, that makes sense. I mean, they're not just throwing these things out there, they're thinking about it a lot before they put it together.
I said I was going to go to the public, but I have one more I want to do, and then I'll do it. Civil forfeiture, which is a controversial issue for some in the criminal justice system. And my sense, but I stand to be corrected, is that the role of civil forfeiture in Putnam County has increased over time. Okay, that's okay. It's not. I see Tim nodding his head. But Del, was civil forfeiture common practice?
I don't think I ever used it in the 8 years that I was in prosecution. I'm not sure we even had it available at that time.
Okay, that's helpful. Bob?
I agree with Del. I'm not sure exactly when it started, but I had very little to do with it as prosecutor. Later I did as judge, but as prosecutor, either of you recall when it started?
It was when I was there, I know it started.
Okay.
And it was, it kind of depends on the situation about what was being forfeited, whether it was money or drugs, obviously, were confiscated. But, there was a recent case in Indiana that went up to the United States Supreme Court.
Over a car.
Over a car. A guy had a Land Rover or Range Rover or something like that, and it's basically the United States Supreme Court said, no, you couldn't do that. So I think you're going to see a curtailing of the civil forfeiture actions, quite frankly. Or there's going to be some law that's going to be
Well, the
modified.
legislature passed a new civil forfeiture law. I haven't done any since 2010.
Haven't done any.
None.
There's been none in Putnam County.
None whatsoever.
You don't do it, then it doesn't happen.
Well, it does happen in that the officers can call the federal officers, and the federal officers can step in and do it. And then they do their own civil forfeiture through the U.S. Attorney's Office. It doesn't involve us.
And does the money or the material that gets acquired, does that come back to Putnam County coffers?
The only thing that would come back if we actually prosecute the person, then you can give a per hour charge as to what your fee was for your office doing that work, and you get reimbursed that amount, but that's it.
Let me get this straight. Since 2010, other than when the feds have invoked, so to speak, civil forfeiture, there's been no other civil forfeiture activities in Putnam County.
Right. And there was going to be a correction when Governor Daniels was governor. The legislature came up with a new law and he vetoed it. So there's been for years sort of a no man's land as to no one knows what to do. So they just sort of sat vacant. The Fed stepped in. Not this time, the year before, the legislature passed a new Civil Forfeiture Act, which if you have an attorney that does it, would be an outside attorney. They have to have their contract approved by the Indiana Attorney General, and it has to be filed there. They've set down how much can be collected. I believe cars are now exempt, and you can't take somebody's automobile. You have to go to court within so many days of the money being seized now, so it's all basically in the judge's hands. We haven't had one. Part of it is the nature of the beast has changed. It used to be people ran up and down Interstate 70 with $300,000-$400,000 in their car. They don't do that anymore. They FedEx their money. So, you know, if you catch enough people, then they change the way they do business. And we don't hit the drugs we used to off the interstate. The cash doesn't come off the interstate even with the Fed. So they're smart. They're changing how they do business.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to go to the podium and get the handheld mic, which I hope is still there. Yes, it is. And I'm going to invite members of the audience to, just assuming I know how to turn this on. Do I? Help. I'm going to invite members of the audience to pose questions to our panelists. And I'm going to ask my man Tyler to tell me how to mic this on. Tyler, could you help me, sir? Yes. So if you have a question for our panelists, would you please identify yourself and speak into the microphone, which is now turned on. Does anybody want to pose a question? I know I can identify. This is Dave Murray, a member of the City Council. Dave.
I was in a jury box once, and Sally Gray was the judge, and was asked to be the foreman of the jury, so I had to report back our decision. And it turned out, she said, "You're not going anywhere because we're going to have a second verdict on a habitual offender." So that made me feel like we probably made the right decision. But she did something that I didn't expect, and she came into the jury room, the side room there, and she processed that trial with us. And when you're sitting in the jury box and you got somebody's life kind of in your hands, you really hope you're making the right decision. And she actually compared notes with us on some of the witnesses, that sort of thing. Is that common practice, those of you that have been judges, or is that unusual?
Sounds unusual to me. I was unaware she did that. I think judges often, I would go back and just say, well, thank them, and then ask if they had any questions or any concerns now. But I wouldn't talk about the actual evidence in the trial itself.
See, okay. I wondered. It was reassuring as a juror for me, but I wondered what the practice was.
Well, I think when I'll go back and, of course, thank them, and I always just say, what can we do for the next jury to make it a better process for you? And a lot of times they're like, did we do the right thing? And I said, well, there's a lot of things that you don't know about this case that have been ruled on before. I've been in court with Mr. Bookwalter 8 times before it came in here on this case, and they're really looking to see whether they got it right. The funny thing I always find out is we think that lawyers that were excluding certain evidence, for instance that habitual portion you're talking about, well, if this guy has 10 prior DUIs, those don't come into play why he's being prosecuted for his 11th DUI, because you just automatically found him guilty. But so we think we've cleverly excluded that, and they'll come in there like, this guy's been here before, hasn't he? I mean, they pick it up. I mean, they're very perceptive about the whole thing. You think they're not paying attention sometimes on some of the real technical issues, but they really are. And I think that's one of the things in Putnam County. I send out 50 jury questionnaires for a major felony. And, some people obviously have excuses, medical excuses. But probably maybe 3 or 4 people don't show up. I mean, it's an incredibly good feeling to me to think that people have enough civic mindedness here in Putnam County to come to court. I tell them, I said, well, maybe that's because you know that I'm going to send a sheriff out after you if you didn't show up. But they do. They show up all the time, and they're willing to sit there and serve. I mean, they don't want to do it every day, obviously, but they really do take their job really at heart, I think.
Thank you. Yes, Ann Newton. This is Ann Newton, and we welcome your question.
I wanted to know whether you've seen an increase in any special crime. I have a trajectory of working with sex offenders since 1991, and I think that's increased a lot. Till now, I'm on the child protection team appointed by Judge Headley, and I can't get over the explosion in this crime, and I'm wondering whether you see it too, whether you saw it as it was happening.
I don't know what it is about Putnam County, but the state police, our post here, covers everything to Terre Haute. And they always say, Tim, you're the child molest capital of the world. I mean, they do. And we have, Ann, you know the case, we have, there's the 15-year-olds having sex with the 20-year-old. That's 21-year-old. I'm talking 40-year-olds having sex with 7-year-olds. And we have more of those very serious cases. I don't know if they're better reported than they were 40 years ago. That may be part of it. But it is that or most of my major felonies that I try with Judge Headley are those. I mean, the real bad cases that bother me and probably bother you are those cases. And I can remember every one of them. I mean, I can remember the kid's name. I can remember the facts, and those never leave me.
2 years ago on the child protection team, I counted the sex offenders. We were having one every other week. We had 26 for the year. That's an awful lot.
If you look at that map, there's an online map you can look at it. I mean, it's just amazing here in the county.
And I think it's also a little bit to do with the massive explosion of methamphetamine. I think the methamphetamine use drives people's sexual desire and they just want to do that with whomever they can find, and the child is an easy mark, unfortunately.
That's one of the biggest things I think I've seen change in this area since I was prosecutor, because I think I didn't hardly see any of them. And a lot of it was it wasn't brought to the office, so we didn't look at them. I only remember trying, I think, one incest case, and then later on, I don't know whether I was working with Bob or Matt, but we tried 3 straight in a row child molest cases, got guilty verdicts on all 3 of them. But that's something in the first 8 years, I don't know, it just never came up. I tell you why I know it existed. Because when I tried to pick a jury on those 3 cases, I had to excuse several women who had been victims. And you could see the emotion when you started talking about it. I just didn't realize it was going on that much. And it just never came to us. So that has been a big change. I think, I don't know, you did defense work. I don't know whether you saw much, and we just didn't have it come in, did we?
Well, the law went into effect in 1979, didn't it, where we all became mandated reporters?
Well, and usually where it comes up, they don't tell mom or dad. They usually are at school. They tell a friend in the cafeteria or at their locker, and then the friend says something to the teacher says something to the counselor, they come in and they have to report by law. So I think we're doing a much better job of reporting. Yeah. But you ask about that 10%?
Yes, sir.
If you have sex with your 7-year-old daughter, you're in that 10%, okay?
Amen. Teresa Botto, I seem to know all the question askers here.
You had said that 80% of the crimes are from drugs, at least that anyway, are caused because of drugs. And I was wondering about treatment centers. How does that work? And are you able to find enough treatment centers to really do any kind of positive things? Or are they basically just shipped out to the prisons and the jails to be dried out, and then hopefully something will happen that will change them, which it doesn't usually do? But I just wondered about that.
There's never enough treatment facilities, number one. We try to do basically with a joint effort with the public defenders, the prosecutor's office of the court, the probation department. We're trying to do something where basically we send them there and make them sit for a little while in the Putnam County Jail, maybe get their brains start working a little bit, and then kind of the deal is, hey, we'll let you out. You got to go into treatment, and you got to go into a significant inpatient or an outpatient type of facility. I mean, the day they walk out of the jail, they're supposed to do that. If they don't, then we bring them back in. So it's that. I was just at a conference today in Indianapolis, and one of the things they talk about is the dopamine effect of like methamphetamine, and they're saying that the high off of that is 1,100. The high off of eating food is like 50 to 75, to give you that high. The high off of a sexual encounter is maybe 150. So that's how much more higher methamphetamine is to your brain. And what happens is, so what's your brain want to think? Well, I want to get back to that. I'm skyrocketed up. That was really great. So that's why they do it. And they even had a curve on a graph, and it actually showed that you actually regress a little bit at first before you start going back up. And this lady was an MD that was giving the presentation. She said it takes 2 years. 2 years for somebody to really get back to where they should be, as far as, and that's a long time. When you got your buddies that are all using meth, and that's why we have a lot of people that come back and come back and come back. But that's the effort we're trying to do, is what kind of treatment facilities. I mean, we have the Hamilton Center here, we have Cummins here, we have I think it's called the Choices. It's the old First Christian Church. Those are just locally. But I think more than anything, you've got to make them sit there and think about it a little bit and kind of get their brain start working again. I mean, we'll see people come in, and I'll see them, 60 days later, they're like a different looking person. They've got maybe a little fat on them all of a sudden, because they've been sitting in jail. They kind of focus. I said, you remember being here with Mr. Bookwalter and me? Like, not really. I don't even remember being there.
And even doing that, our success rate is, the first time we did this program, 60 days in jail, then it's almost like AA. It's like every night you've got to go. And I think we were a little wet behind the ears of what success meant. I figured we were going to have 60, 70% success rate. I think the first time around it was about 10%.
It's not good.
I think we're up to about 30, and we think that's pretty darn good right now. So
Right.
Still there's a ton of.
And there's a thing called MAT, medically assisted therapy, and where they are, there's a huge opioid crisis in Indiana. It's here, but it's not as significant as some other counties, thankfully. But so they're given this stuff called Suboxone to these folks. Well, Suboxone is also can be abused, but it's kind of like, I'm going to give this guy a 6% beer, or I'm going to give him a non-alcoholic beer or a light beer. It's the less of two evils. And they said with doing that, they might get like 20%. That's the people they're trying to affect. So
Suboxones are in small little strips that are easily hidden, and that is the number one thing that's taken into the Putnamville Correctional Facility, Suboxone.
I volunteer there, and that's a big problem.
Huge
a big
problem.
I was wondering, is there any more money allocated for treatment? Because, it's so much more expensive to put them in even in jail, but much less in prison, which happens right after they fall back out, like you say. How is that? Is that something that the legislature is looking at, or the judges are?
a lot of people can.
Or what's going on there?
Well, there's a I can't remember what it's called right now. Tim probably is. Recovery Works.
Yeah.
recovery works. If you can qualify for that, and that's kind of what we're doing during that 60 days, trying to get somebody to qualify for that so that we can get them into a treatment facility so that they don't really have to pay for it. You know, it's your tax dollar. And again, a lot of people say, why do I have to have my tax dollar treat drug addicts? I'm like, well, maybe it's your grandson or your granddaughter, and maybe that person is really a good person but got in the wrong crowd at the wrong time. And if we do this, maybe we can hit her or him back and get their ships, righted, and they become a productive member of society. And you got to remember that, Tim said the 10%, they need to be in prison, but eventually these people are going to get out. If you don't do something treatment-wise, we're just going to see them again. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, Tim, they have these files, going electronic, by the way, but we have files. Everybody has a file jacket, and like some guys, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones will have, and the prosecutor will bring them down, there are like 10 of them, and that's not an exaggeration.
But what's changed is since Bob's day, we had Richmond State Hospital, where you could commit somebody, and they'd go out to Richmond. They might spend a year there becoming clean. When I was young, Lawyer Central State was a big facility on the west side of Indianapolis. They don't exist anymore. Everybody thought you could give somebody a pill, and that's how you treat folks. Well, there's certain people that need inpatient treatment for either mental health or drugs, and there are very few facilities for that now. And I do blame the state for that, for basically, but that came from a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists that felt that, it was wrong to, lock people up at Central State. Well, there's some people that need that for a while.
We're still using Richmond.
Yeah, but not.
It's...
You need a special referral to get there, though.
You got, the only real state hospital you've got left is Logansport, that I think where they really, the mental cases, so.
At Evansville.
But 80 down there.
But those are for significantly mentally challenged people that, they're never going to get better.
Other questions? Susanna Hardesty.
During your tenure as prosecutor, what action that you've taken have you been most proud of?
Well, the really tough cases, and I'm not proud about capital cases, don't misunderstand me, but there was, those were really tough cases to try, and we were successful in those. And I might mention something so that people understand, and it can be really frustrating for prosecutors to absolutely work so hard on a case. And like Bennick, 20 years later, the Supreme Court comes out with a decision that changes everything. And then Tim was still working with it 20 years later. In the one case of Zachary, the child molester who killed the 10-year-old boy, that one's frustrating because we had probably the most perfect case that you could ever see. I mean, when you've got a brother who's sitting there and they videotaped, and Dick Rice back here was one of what he did was tremendous. And this guy is telling you, because his brother spilled the guts to him, and he's showing emotion, and this sounds bad, but even snot was coming out of his nose. I mean, the emotions were so strong. And then the jury sees a videotape of the defendant who is cool, calm, just goes through we thought he was a serial killer. We had a beautiful case. And when it went up on appeal, it got to the federal level, and they reversed the death sentence because his attorneys hadn't brought up his childhood. And, from the prosecutor angle, we couldn't do anything about that. We couldn't present cases. But to me, that was extremely frustrating when you've worked so hard and then years later something comes up and something you could not have done anything about at the time flips it around, and all that work for nothing. And I don't know about Bob, but I'm still kind of angry about that.
I'm angry because I inherited both cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 20 years later, and it comes up.
He's doing 130 years right now. There was no life without parole at the time, so when the death penalty got set aside, there was no. Minnick was an interesting individual, and he filed briefs this thick every month, and usually accusing Dell of stuff. And so when he was too mentally ill to be sentenced. So Dell helped me on this, Dell and Bob both, because I inherited it years later. They brought me up to speed. So we went down to Bedford. And the interesting thing, there's a bunch of oddities in the case, but both the judge in Tippecanoe County that did Christopher Stevens and the judge in Lawrence County that did Minnick both committed suicide. It's the darndest thing I've ever seen.
There's something other unique to that,
Yeah.
too.
And
But-
it's not Dell or my fault.
But when we got the sentencing on him, they said he was too crazy to be sentenced as lawyers. So I said, well, let's put him on the stand. If he's that crazy, it'll show. And I put Martha Payne, the young lady that was raped, murdered, electrocuted, right down past Goban Church. I put her mother on, who was 90 and dying of cancer. And she said, I just want to know what happened to my daughter. And Minnick, Eric Burns, he was sitting there, Minnick kind of admitted to it. He felt so bad that the mother did that after all these years and all this filing, he apologized to her. He apologized to the mother in the courtroom. And since that day, I've never gotten one piece of paper from him. He's never filed one more piece of paper. It's the darndest thing. But these... The spookiest thing on Stevens, Dick Rice was sitting next to me when we gave him life without parole, it was about 8 o'clock at night, and we'd been there for 12 hours, and we read the factual basis of what he did to Zachary Snyder. And he got the biggest smile on his face, didn't he, Dick? And it was the spookiest thing I think I'd ever seen. And I'm not a big believer in good and evil, but he was evil. Dick, you were there. I mean, it spooked and there were 20 guards in that courtroom, and I think it spooked everybody in that courtroom. A smile came over his face.
Other hands up? Kelsey Kaufman? Kelsey Kaufman?
I have a question for Matt and Bob, and that is whether becoming a judge changed your view of the prosecutor's office, and if so, in what ways?
Well, Matt became prosecutor when I became judge, so. I don't think it did. Judge, the attorneys are then looking at you thinking, are you going to now favor the state because you're a prosecutor, or are you going to go the other direction to prove to everybody that you won't favor the state and start favoring the defense? So you have to pay more careful attention to being fair. But no, I don't think it did otherwise.
What's the question?
Whether becoming a judge has changed your view of the prosecutor's office. And one of the things that I often hear, especially up at the legislature, tensions between judges and prosecutors. And I'm just wondering if shifting office has changed your view on them.
I'm going to have to agree with Bob for the most part on that. I mean, it is an adversarial system, okay? I mean, there's somebody that wants the prosecution, wants a conviction, right? There's somebody over here that says, prove it, even though, my guy might be really guilty, but you got to prove it, Mr. Prosecutor, and I'm kind of going back and forth about it, and yeah, it gets tension because we're talking about people's lives. Are they going to go to prison? Are they not going to go to prison? Are they going to go to jail? Are they not going to go to jail? So I don't think really, I think all of us have our unique style a little bit, but for the most part we're under our oath, and I think everybody that's sitting up here has done it to the best of their ability. Had they probably made every decision right? Would they like to have a couple back? Probably so. But you just got to sit there and listen to what they have, and sometimes because of being in the prosecutor's office, I can see where the kink is. Why Tim is pleading this guy to this, because I can see what has happened, and that's a good thing, I think.
Other questions from the audience? Raise your hand, don't be bashful.
I was wondering how often you use mediated kinds of systems and for justice kind of things. like having a mediator come in and do some kind of stuff in that regard.
We don't use those for criminal here. You could, I guess, but that's usually what the prosecutor and the defense attorney are doing.
We did it one time on the Christopher Stevens case that killed Zachary Snyder. I guess we sort of got wind through the trial judge in Judge Bush in Tippecanoe County that the Chief Justice of the Indiana Supreme Court thought it might be a good idea to try it. So they had a judge from Henry County, retired judge, come over, and we, for 12 hours, mediated the issue of the death penalty versus life without parole with Stevens. What we found was, which I was shocked to find, that the problem was that Stevens wanted to die. He wanted the death penalty, and his lawyers were trying to talk him out of it. So Dick and I sat back there all day long, back and forth, but that ended up being the issue, that Stevens actually did not want to live in prison for the rest of his life.
I'm going to mention something that no one's discussed, and I'm thinking I got to pick on Matt because Matt sent a note saying that the older guys, he might remind us because we might forget. I think he's talking about Bob and I, so I got to pick on him just a little bit.
It was just you, Doug.
When he's young, we get on a couple of things here. When he's young, he was so wet behind the ears. I mean, it was terrible. And so one day I pull up at night, and now I don't know why he did this, but I think I know. He's got this private practice, and he worked every night, and he had his shades wide open, and it was bright in there. And I think what he was doing is letting the whole county know how hard a worker he was, okay? But he's now a deputy prosecutor. So I've got to point out a couple things to him. This is back when we had a bag phone. I call him, I see him walk back there, and he picks the phone up, and I said something about me. I think you remember this one, don't you? And I said to him, I said, you really look nice in there. That office is lit up. But I said, you got to remember you're a deputy prosecutor now, and you make enemies, and you're one hell of a target. I said, from now on when you work, I said, Bob and I always close the shades when we work at night. I think from that time on, he was so surprised that anybody even cared about him, see? But he started closing his shades every night after that. I had to pick on you on that one.
More seriously, that reminds me that I had my car window smashed out by a defendant. I couldn't prove who it was, but I knew who it was. Same fellow burned down Dell's private law office. Again, we knew he did it, but we couldn't prove it. So, retaliation is danger in prosecuting.
Matt got socked once, black-eyed, didn't you, at one time as prosecutor?
I got punched in the courtroom. Yeah, I got punched in the courtroom.
Bob, building on what you just said, Bob, let me ask you, did you fear for your safety while you were prosecutor?
Well, I tried not to think about it, but I did wear a gun under my pants leg most of the time. We didn't have courtroom security. Call the police, but it was just going to take them a while to get there. And they knew where you were, and you had a private law office if you were part-time, and it would have been very easy for them, somebody to...
Did you fear more for your safety when you were prosecutor than when you were later judge?
I kept the gun on for a while I was judge also. But I did as prosecutor. You're sitting there in the courtroom with your back to everybody, where you're at the desk. Anybody almost can come into the courtroom. And at the time, as I said, when I was prosecutor in Dell and until time thereafter, there was no courtroom security, courthouse security at all, except insofar as police officers happened to be there for some other business. There was not anybody on staff to guard anybody in the courthouse.
Bill, did you fear for your safety?
I'll tell you a story. My wife was scared to death a couple of times. During the Minute case, of course, there had been bomb threats made, and even Judge Elton, they moved him completely out of his house and relocated him. And they had a police car in our driveway. The only problem was it didn't have a flat tire or something, so we didn't think they would pay too much attention to it. But I had a police radio that immediate to dispatch. And the only time, I'm just kind of joking here a little bit, the only time I should have feared a little bit was Jack Hanlon was driving me over to Brazil, and the curly-headed Raritan. And Raritan was my bodyguard that day. So he comes up and pecks on the window, and Jack rolls the window down. He says, "Jack, could you do me a favor?" And Jack says, "What's wrong? Raritan, did you forget your gun?" And he forgot his gun, so he borrowed one from Jack, and that was my bodyguard that day.
How about you,
Funny
Matt?
things.
Did you fear for your safety when you were prosecutor?
Well, I guess when I was young, I really wasn't thinking about it too much. Have the distinguishing of being punched in the courtroom when I was a deputy prosecutor. And for those of you who know Bob, he's got a pretty dry wit, and so we're all sitting there. It's me, Dell, Ann, and him. We're all talking about our cases, and Bob said, "Well, Dell, how many years you got?" And the prosecutor was like, 18, and Ann was 12, and Bob was whatever. And looking at me, he goes, "You guys ever been punched before?" I'm like, "No." He looked at me and goes, "What are you saying to those guys in there, Matt?"
You've been on the job maybe a year or so.
Yeah, I still have the picture. I had a lot more hair. Black eye, yeah. But yeah, I mean, the reason we have security now is a guy came in and threatened me during a juvenile hearing, but he was not the juvenile's parents or anything, and we just happened to have a police officer there, and the guy was coming at me, and thank goodness Charlie Hallam, I still owe him a pizza, I think, just grabbed that guy and threw him down on the ground and just pancaked him. It was unbelievable, but it shook everybody up so much that day that we couldn't even do court for an hour or two because everybody's adrenaline was just pumped up so high. People were trying to say sentences and they weren't coming out correctly. So it was very, very, very scary.
Something I want to say, since I worked with these two guys for quite a few years, and my entire time as prosecutor, I never saw anything where decisions were made for political reasons or made for the wrong reasons or bribes or anything like that. Sometimes people, you hear them talk and they're around the kitchen and all that. But I never saw it. And I have a lot of respect. And I never worked with Tim as a prosecutor, but when he was a defense lawyer, I'll say this about him. As a prosecutor, you never want to convict an innocent man. And you really feel better when you've got a good, strong defense lawyer actually on the other side, because you're going to feel like justice is going to prevail. I never worried about when Tim was on the other side. I knew he'd be working for his client and be fighting hard. But I appreciate a good, hard fight once in a while, and Tim and I had quite a few. But he did the job for his client, and I'm sure he's doing it as a prosecutor too. So I don't want to make those comments because, what people think sometimes is just not true.
I always worried because I knew he's going to do. I was like, I've got this case down. What is Tim going to do? He's going to do something that's going to. He's going to win somehow. And like all of us, we learn a lot more from our defeats than we do from our wins.
We are competitive too, aren't we? Mm-hmm. No matter what.
Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Going 3 times. Can we have a round of applause for these gentlemen?